The sun rose between the pine trees of the Rocky Mountains when Thomas Macready adjusted his axe on his shoulder and walked toward the forest. At 42 years old, he knew every trail, every tree, every sound of that woods, as well as he knew the lines of his own hand. The cool morning air entered his lungs with the comforting familiarity of someone who had always lived there, in that small Montana town called Timber Falls. His father had been a lumberjack, as had his grandfather. Thomas had grown up amidst the smell of sawdust and the sound of axes echoing through the forest. He had learned from a young age that a tree had to be respected before being felled, that the forest provided sustenance but demanded care in return. It wasn't just a job for him, it was a way of life, a connection to something greater than himself. That September morning, however, there was something different in the air. Thomas couldn't quite put his finger on what, but he felt a weight on his chest, an unease that had been with him since he woke up. Sarah, his wife, had noticed it too. She had watched him during breakfast with that look she'd known for 20 years of marriage, a look that said she knew something was bothering him, but that she would wait until he was ready to talk. The children, on the other hand, were oblivious to any tension. 15-year-old Emma complained about her math test, while 12-year-old Josh tried to convince his father to take him to the forest on the weekend. Thomas smiled at his son, ruffled his brown hair, and promised that yes, they would go camping as soon as he finished clearing the northeast section. But that weight on his chest wouldn't leave him. Thomas drove his old red pickup truck to base camp, where his team was already gathered. There were 6 men in total, all known to him for years. Mike, the oldest of the group, was already preparing the chainsaw with his usual meticulousness. Danny and his brother Robert were discussing Sunday's football game. Carlos adjusted the safety straps while whistling a country song. Everything seemed normal. Everything should have been normal. They worked all morning. The roar of the chainsaws, the cracking of the wood, the smell of fresh pine. It was all part of the routine. Thomas had always felt at peace there, doing the work he loved, providing for his family, being part of something that had been passed down through generations. But that morning, even amidst the familiarity, the unease persisted. It was during lunch that Mike mentioned the rumors. "I heard that Western Lumber is in negotiations to sell," he said casually, biting into his sandwich. Thomas looked up. Western Lumber was the company that employed them, that employed practically half the town of Timber Falls. "Where did you get that from?" "My sister-in-law works at the office. She said she saw some Denver executives there last week. Guys in suits. You know how it is." "That doesn't mean anything," Thomas replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Danny chimed in. "My cousin who works at the sawmill said the same thing. He said the shifts are being reduced." The weight on Thomas's chest intensified. They went back to work, but now the conversation had planted a seed of worry that grew with each passing hour. Thomas tried to focus on the trees, on the work, on the sequence of movements he knew so well, but his mind kept returning to the same question. What if it were true? What if the company was really being sold? When he returned home that night, Sarah was preparing dinner. The smell of roasting meat filled the kitchen. Emma was doing her homework at the table, and Josh was watching television in the living room. It was such a perfectly normal, comforting scene that Thomas felt a pang of fear at the thought of something disturbing it. "You're quiet today," Sarah observed as she placed the plates on the table. Thomas sighed. There was no point in hiding anything from her. "I heard rumors at work about the company." Sarah stopped what she was doing and stared at him. She didn't need to ask to understand the gravity of the situation. In cities like Timber Falls, when the main industry faltered, everything faltered. "It's just rumors," he said, more to himself than to her. "Probably nothing." But these weren't just rumors. 3 days later, all the Western Lumber employees were summoned to a meeting. Thomas parked his pickup truck in the sawmill parking lot and saw dozens of other trucks there, men walking toward the large shed with serious expressions. He greeted acquaintances with nods, but no one spoke much. Everyone knew that meetings like that rarely brought good news. The regional manager, a middle-aged man named Harold Preston, climbed onto a makeshift platform. Beside him stood two men in suits whom Thomas had never seen before. Executives from somewhere far away, he thought, people who made decisions about lives without ever having set foot in a forest. "Gentlemen," Preston began, his voice sounding tired, "I appreciate you all being here. I know there have been rumors circulating in recent weeks, and I am here today to clarify the situation." The silence in the warehouse was absolute. Western Lumber was acquired by Consolidated Timber Corporation. Operations here in Timber Falls will be gradually transferred to their facilities in Oregon, where they have more modern technology and lower operating costs. Thomas felt the ground move beneath his feet. Preston continued, explaining about severance packages, relocation assistance, and job retraining programs. But Thomas could barely hear. His mind was racing, calculating, trying to understand what it all meant. No job, no Western Lumber, no more of the only thing he knew how to do. Around him, other men had similar expressions of shock, anger, and disbelief. Someone asked about the deadlines. Another protested about the years of service. Preston responded with the patience of someone who was also just following orders, someone who would probably also lose his job at the end of the process. When Thomas arrived home, Sarah was in the kitchen. She saw him through the window getting out of the pickup truck and knew immediately. He didn't need to say anything. She just approached and hugged him, and they stood there in the kitchen, united by 20 years of history and now by a frightening uncertainty about the future. "We'll figure it out," she whispered. "We always do." But this time Thomas wasn't so sure. The following weeks were a whirlwind of emotions and changes. The sawmill began to reduce operations. Some employees were laid off immediately, others were kept on to oversee the gradual closure. Thomas was among the latter, which was both a blessing and torture. He had a few more weeks of pay, but also had to watch, day after day, the dismantling of everything he knew. Timber Falls entered a kind of collective mourning. The entire town depended on the lumber industry. The diner on Main Street began closing early due to a lack of customers. The hardware store laid off 2 employees. The gas station reduced its hours. It was like watching a living organism slowly wither away. Thomas tried to find another job. He sent resumes to sawmills in other cities, to construction companies, even to a national park that needed rangers. But the crisis wasn't just affecting Timber Falls. The lumber industry was changing across the country, consolidating, modernizing, needing fewer men and more machines. The Macready family's savings began to dwindle. Sarah, who worked part-time at the town library, took on more hours, but it wasn't enough. They cut expenses wherever they could. They cancelled their cable TV service, reduced their trips to the supermarket, and stopped eating out. Emma had to give up her piano lessons. Josh didn't get the new bicycle they wanted to give him for Christmas. Thomas felt a terrible weight of inadequacy. He was the provider, the father, the man of the house, and he was failing in his most basic role. Sometimes, late at night, he would lie awake staring at the ceiling, Sarah sleeping beside him, wondering where he had gone wrong, what he could have done differently. "You didn't do anything wrong," Sarah told him one of those nights, realizing he was awake. "The world changed, not you." But that didn't console him. Whether the world changed or not, the result was the same. He couldn't support his family. It was on one of those dark nights, lying in the darkness of his room, that Thomas did something he hadn't done in a long time. He prayed. It wasn't that he didn't believe in God. He had been raised in a Christian family, attended church as a child, and even participated in the choir as a young man. But as the years passed, Faith had become something in the background, something present but not active, like a picture on the wall that you stop noticing because it's always there. Now in desperation he was seeking that connection again. "God," he whispered in the darkness, "I don't know if you're listening to me. It's been a long time since I've spoken to you, but I'm lost. I don't know what to do. My family needs me and I can't help them. Please show me a way. Give me strength to go on." There was no response, of course. He hadn't expected one. But even so, something inside him felt a little lighter for having spoken those words, for having admitted his vulnerability to something bigger than himself. Sarah, whom he thought was asleep, reached out her hand in the dark and squeezed it. Thomas's last day of work at Western Lumber was a cold Friday in November. He arrived early, as he always did, and walked through the nearly deserted facilities. The sawmill, which had once operated in 3 shifts, was now silent. The machines, once roaring constantly, were at a standstill. The smell of fresh wood that had always permeated the air was dissipating. Mike was there, also on his last day. They greeted each other with a silent nod, sharing a moment of mourning for something they both loved and were losing. "What are you going to do?" Mike asked. "I don't know yet. And you?" "My brother-in-law has a mechanic shop in Billings. He said he could give me a job there. It's not the same, but—" "Yes," Thomas agreed, "it's not the same." They worked their last shift organizing tools, cataloging equipment, filling out forms. Sterile administrative work that felt like a desecration after years of working with their hands, creating something tangible. When the whistle blew for the last time, marking the end of the workday, Thomas stood still for a moment, listening to the echo die down. Then he picked up his empty lunchbox, his worn helmet, and walked toward the exit. Preston was waiting for him outside with an envelope. "Your severance pay and final settlements," he said, extending the package. "I'm sorry, Thomas. You're a good man. You deserved better." Thomas took the envelope and nodded. He couldn't speak. He was afraid that if he opened his mouth, something inside him would break. He drove home slowly, postponing the moment of arrival, of having to face the reality of his new situation. He passed Main Street, saw the diner with half its tables empty, the hardware store with a clearance sale sign, the gas station with only one employee. Timber Falls was dying along with the industry that sustained it. When he finally got home, Sarah was in the kitchen. She looked at him, at the envelope in his hand, and said nothing. She just went over and hugged him. He rested his face on her shoulder and for the first time in months allowed himself to cry. The following months were the hardest of Thomas's life. The compensation money didn't last forever. He continued looking for work, but the options were increasingly scarce. A few temporary jobs here and there, helping with the construction of a barn, clearing snow from the roads in winter, chopping wood for neighbors, but nothing permanent, nothing that offered the stability his family needed. The pressure began to take its toll. Thomas grew increasingly silent, more distant. He saw Sarah's efforts, saw his children adapting to the new reality with the resilience typical of children, and felt even more inadequate. Emma had gotten a part-time job at the supermarket to help out. His 15-year-old daughter was working to help support the family, and this was destroying him inside. One night, in a moment of profound despair, Thomas grabbed the keys to his pickup truck and simply drove. He had no destination in mind. He just needed to get out, to move, to do something other than sit at home feeling useless. He drove along the empty roads of Montana under a starry sky, passing through forests that had once been his workplace and now seemed like forbidden territory. Eventually he found himself in the parking lot of the old church on the edge of town. It was a simple wooden structure with a white cross on top and benches that could accommodate perhaps 50 people. Thomas hadn't been inside for years. For a long moment he just sat in the pickup truck, staring at the building. Then, almost without thinking, he opened the door. and got out. The church was open. Reverend Miller always left it unlocked, trusting that no one would rob a house of God in a small town like Timber Falls. The interior was dark, illuminated only by the moonlight filtering through the simple windows. Thomas walked down the aisle between the pews and sat down in the first pew. She looked at the crucifix on the front wall, at the simple altar, and felt a wave of emotion she couldn't name. Anger, sadness, despair, perhaps all of that together. "I tried," he said aloud, his voice echoing in the empty space. "God, I really tried. I've worked hard my whole life. I was a good husband, a good father. I tried to be a good man. And yet, everything is falling apart. Why? What did I do to deserve this?" The words came out in a torrent, months of frustration and fear being released. He spoke of feeling like a failure, of not being able to provide for his family, of seeing his children suffer and being powerless to do anything. He spoke until there were no more words, until he was just sitting there, exhausted and empty. That's when he heard a soft voice behind him. Sometimes the answer isn't why, it's what we do next. Thomas turned and saw Reverend Miller walking down the hallway. He was a man of about 60, with grey hair, a gentle face marked by lines that spoke of a life spent smiling and listening. "Reverend," said Thomas, feeling suddenly embarrassed. "I didn't know anyone was here. I was in the back, preparing the Sunday sermon. I heard you arrive." Miller sat down on the bench next to Thomas. "Want to talk about it?" And Thomas spoke. He told the Reverend everything, the loss of his job, the financial difficulties, the feeling of inadequacy, the fear of the future. Miller simply listened, nodding occasionally, offering the occasional comment, but mostly just being present. "Do you know the story of Job?" Miller asked when Thomas finally finished. "Vaguely. The man who lost everything, right?" "Exactly. Job was a good, prosperous man with a family he loved. Then in a test of faith, he lost everything, his wealth, his children, his health, and his friends came to him and said that he must have sinned, that God was punishing him for something." "It looks familiar," Thomas murmured bitterly. "But here's the important part," Miller continued. "In the end, it wasn't about what Job had done wrong. It was about trusting God even when we don't understand the plan. Job questioned, got angry, demanded answers. God wasn't offended by that. God can handle our anger and our doubts." Thomas looked at his calloused hands. "I don't know if I have enough faith for this, Reverend." "Faith isn't about being certain, Thomas. It's about continuing when we're not. It's about taking the next step, even when we don't see the whole path." Miller placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You're not alone in this. Your family is with you. This community is with you. And God is with you, even when it doesn't seem like He is." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Thomas asked, "How do I get back? To the faith, I mean. It's been so long." "You start exactly where you are. There's no grand gesture needed. Just come on Sunday. Sit down, listen, let yourself be present. The rest will follow." Thomas nodded slowly. "Thank you, Reverend." "Go home, Thomas. Your family needs not the perfect provider, but the real you, present and trying. That's more than enough." When Thomas returned home that night, Sarah was still awake, waiting for him with concern on her face. He told her where he had been, about his conversation with Reverend Miller. She held his hand and said, "Perhaps we should go to church on Sunday, as a family." And they went. It was strange at first, sitting again on those wooden benches, singing hymns that kind of reminded him of his childhood, listening to Reverend Miller's sermon about perseverance and hope. Emma seemed bored, Josh restless. But Sarah squeezed Thomas's hand during the prayer, and he felt something stir within him. Not a dramatic revelation, not a magic answer to his problems, just a small seed of peace. They continued going, Sunday after Sunday. Slowly, Thomas began to reconnect with the faith community he had left behind. The people at church knew of his difficulties, the whole town knew, but there was no judgment, only support. Mrs. Henderson brought pies for the family. Mr. Jameson, who had a small farm, offered Thomas some occasional work. They were small gestures, but they meant the world. And gradually, Thomas began to feel a change. Not in his external circumstances, those were still difficult, but in how he faced them. He realized he had spent so much time focused on what he had lost that he had forgotten what he still had. He had Sarah, strong and constant by his side. He had Emma and Josh, resilient and loving. He had his health, his abilities, and now a community that cared. One spring morning, a few months after returning to church, Thomas was having coffee when Sarah casually mentioned something. "I ran into Helen Morrison at the library yesterday," she said. "She told me the state park is looking for someone to do trail maintenance and general conservation work. It doesn't pay much, but..." Thomas looked at her. "That would be working in the forest again." "Yes, not exactly what you did, but..." He didn't let her finish. He was already looking for the park's office number. The work at the state park was different from what Thomas had done before. It wasn't about cutting down trees for the lumber industry. It was about preserving them, caring for the land, creating and maintaining trails so that other people could appreciate the natural beauty he had always loved. The pay was modest, about half of what he had earned before, but it was honest and regular. Most importantly, Thomas discovered that he loved the work. There was something deeply satisfying about tending the forest rather than just harvesting it. He cleared trails overgrown with vegetation, repaired wooden bridges over streams, and marked diseased trees that needed to be removed for safety. He worked alone most of the time, with only the sounds of birds and the wind in the trees for company. And as he worked, he thought about how the loss of his old job, so devastating at the time, had led him down this new path. About how being forced to seek help had reconnected him with his faith and his community. About how the hardships had, in some strange way, strengthened his family instead of destroying it. One afternoon, while repairing a fence near a popular trail, Thomas heard voices approaching. It was a family, 2 parents and 2 young children, walking along the path. The children were excited, pointing at a squirrel, marveling at how tall the trees were. "Thank you for keeping these trails so beautiful," said one of the parents as they passed Thomas. "Our children love coming here." That simple expression of gratitude touched something deep within Thomas. His previous work had also been important, providing wood for building houses, creating furniture, things that people needed. But there was something special about caring for a space where families made memories, where children learned to love nature. Sarah had also found her way. With Thomas working again, she was able to pursue a long-held passion and began taking early childhood education classes at the community college in the neighboring town. It was something she had always wanted to do but never had the time. Now, driving an hour round trip 2 nights a week, she was working toward a degree that would perhaps allow her to become a teacher. Emma, who had matured tremendously during the crisis, kept her job at the supermarket and began saving for college. She now talked about studying business, about perhaps one day opening her own business. The hardships had taught her the value of money and the importance of resilience in ways that prosperity never could have. Josh, always the most carefree, seemed to have emerged from the experience with a deeper appreciation for family. He spent more time at home now, less time playing video games, more time helping with household chores, and simply talking to his parents. The Macready family wasn't rich. They still saved carefully, still thought twice before buying anything non-essential. But there was a different kind of richness in their lives now, an intimacy, a gratitude, an awareness of what truly mattered. Thomas continued attending church, but now not just as someone seeking help. He became active in the community, helping with building repairs, participating in Bible study groups, and even volunteering to help other families who were experiencing financial difficulties. He now understood what it was like to be broken and to rebuild, and he could offer not only practical help, but also hope based on real experience. One Sunday, almost 2 years after losing his job, Reverend Miller asked Thomas to share his testimony with the congregation. Thomas hesitated initially. He had never been much of a public speaker, but Sarah encouraged him, and he finally agreed. Standing on the pulpit, gazing at the familiar faces of the congregation, Thomas felt his heart pound. He took a deep breath and began. 2 years ago, I thought I had lost everything. I lost my job, I almost lost my house, and for a while I almost lost my faith. I was angry at God for allowing this to happen to me and my family. I had worked hard, tried to do everything right, and yet it seemed like I was being punished. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But looking back now, I see that I didn't lose everything. In fact, I gained something far more valuable. I gained a deeper understanding of what truly matters. I gained an appreciation for the strength of my family, the kindness of this community, and the constant presence of God, even in the darkest moments. His eyes met Sarah's in the front row, silent tears streaming down her face, smiling at him with love and pride. I wouldn't recommend anyone go through what we went through. It was painful, terrifying, and there were times when I wasn't sure if we would survive. But we did. And we are stronger now, not despite the hardships, but because of them. He looked at Reverend Miller, who nodded encouragingly. If there's anyone here today going through hard times, feeling like they've lost everything, I want you to know, you are not alone. God has not abandoned you, even if it seems that way. And sometimes it's necessary to lose everything to discover what truly cannot be taken from us. My faith, my family, my hope, these things remained even when everything else crumbled. He stepped down from the pulpit to warm applause, but more importantly for him, to embraces from his family. In that moment, standing in the small wooden church in Timber Falls, Montana, Thomas McCready knew with absolute certainty that he had found his way back not only to faith, but to himself. The following years brought their own joys and challenges, as all years do. Timber Falls never fully returned to what it once was. The logging industry had irreversibly changed, but the town found new ways to survive. Tourism increased, with more people discovering the beauty of Montana's Rocky Mountains. Some of the former loggers, including Mike, returned and opened small businesses catering to visitors, craft shops, tour guides, inns. Thomas continued working at the state park. He was eventually promoted to maintenance supervisor, overseeing a small team. He trained new employees, teaching them not only technical skills, but also the love for the forest that his father had instilled in him. Sarah completed her degree and landed a job as a teaching assistant at Timber Falls Elementary School. She loved working with children and discovered she had a natural gift for it. Her classroom became known as a place where children felt safe, valued, and inspired to learn. Emma was accepted into a state university on a partial scholarship. She was studying business administration and talked about returning to Timber Falls one day to help revitalize the local economy. Thomas had no doubt that she would do just that. His daughter had inherited both her determination and Sarah's compassion. Josh discovered a passion for biology and ecology, inspired by his father's stories about the forest and the hikes they took together. He talked about studying environmental conservation, about finding ways to balance human needs with the preservation of nature. It filled Thomas with pride to see his son inspired by the same love for the forest that had shaped his own life. But perhaps the most significant change was in Thomas himself. The man who had almost been broken by the loss of his job had emerged stronger, wiser, more compassionate. He now understood that strength didn't mean never falling, but getting up every time you fell. That faith didn't mean having all the answers, but trusting even when you didn't have them. He became a source of strength and wisdom for others in the community. When young David Parker lost his job at the hardware store, it was Thomas who reached out to him, offered words of encouragement, and helped him find temporary work while he looked for something permanent. When the Gonzalez family faced a financial crisis after the father had an accident, it was Thomas who organized a fundraising campaign at the church. He didn't do these things out of obligation or for recognition. He did them because he understood, in a visceral and profound way, what it was like to be at rock bottom, and he also understood that no one gets out of those dark places alone. One autumn afternoon, 5 years after losing his job at Western Lumber, Thomas was working on a particularly remote trail in the park. The air was crisp, and the smell of fallen leaves filled his lungs. The surrounding trees were painted in shades of gold and red, a spectacle of beauty that never failed to move him. He paused for a moment, leaning on his tool, and looked around. He thought of the man he had been 5 years ago, so sure of his path, so certain he knew how his life would turn out. That man had vanished in the crisis, and in his place was someone different. Not necessarily better or worse, just different. More humble, perhaps. More grateful, certainly. His phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a message from Sarah. Emma called. She got accepted into the internship program she wanted. Josh got an A on his biology test. Special dinner tonight to celebrate. I love you. Thomas smiled, put his phone away, and went back to work. But while he worked, his heart was light. Yes, they still had challenges. Money was still tight sometimes. Life still brought its difficulties. But they had each other. They had their faith. They had hope. And in the end, Thomas had learned these were the only things that truly mattered. That evening, when the whole family was gathered around the table for the celebratory dinner, Thomas asked to say the prayer before the meal. It was something they did regularly now, a ritual that united them and reminded them to be grateful. "Dear God," he began, his voice firm but full of emotion, "thank you for this food, for this family, for this life. Thank you for the obvious blessings and the hidden ones. Thank you for the difficult moments that made us stronger, and for the joyful moments that made us grateful." He opened his eyes for a moment and looked around the table. Sarah, with tears in her eyes as always when he said the prayer. Emma, already a young adult, mature beyond her years. Josh, growing fast with the sparkle in his eyes of someone who has big dreams. "Thank you," he continued, "for never abandoning us, even when we thought we were alone. Thank you for showing us that losing everything is sometimes the first step in finding what truly matters. Amen." "Amen," echoed the voices of his family. And as they began to eat dinner, laughing and talking, sharing stories of the day, Thomas Macready knew with absolute certainty that he was a rich man, not in money, not in material possessions, but in the things that truly had value. He had lost his job, almost lost his house, almost lost his hope, but never, not even in the darkest moments, had he lost his faith, and that faith, tested and refined by the fire of adversity, had become the foundation upon which he had rebuilt his life. Years later, when Thomas was an older man, with completely grey hair, retired from his job at the park but still active in the community and the church, he often reflected on those difficult years. People sometimes asked him if he had any regrets, if he wished things had been different. His answer was always the same: "I wouldn't wish those hardships on anyone. They were the most difficult years of my life. But they were also the years that taught me who I really was, that showed me what really mattered. So no, I wouldn't change anything. Every trial, every tear, every moment of despair brought me here, and this is exactly where I should be." He said this sitting on the porch of his house, the same house he had almost lost all those years ago, looking at the mountains that had been his constant companion throughout his life. Sarah was usually by his side, her hand in his, a silent touch that said more than words ever could. Emma had returned to Timber Falls, as she had promised. She opened a small consulting business, helping local companies grow and prosper. She married a young man from the neighboring town and gave Thomas and Sarah 2 beautiful grandchildren who filled their lives with joy. Josh became a conservation biologist, working for a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving forests. He traveled frequently, but always returned home, always bringing stories from distant places and important work. And he always credited his father for inspiring his love of nature. Timber Falls had transformed over the years. It was no longer the lumber town Thomas had known in his youth. It was now a diverse community, with tourism, small businesses, and some tech startups taking advantage of the natural beauty and lower cost of living. The old sawmill had been converted into a community center and museum, preserving the town's history and honoring those who had worked there. Thomas would sometimes visit the museum, look at the old photos, the preserved equipment, and reminisce. Not with bitterness, but with a kind of gentle nostalgia. It had been an important part of his life, but it wasn't his whole story. It was just one chapter, and the following chapters had been equally important, perhaps even more so. The church was still there, the same simple wooden structure, although it had undergone some renovations over the years. Reverend Miller had eventually retired, replaced by a young, energetic pastor full of fresh ideas. But the essence of the place remained the same, a place of community, faith, and mutual support. Thomas was still active in the church, now as one of the elders, offering guidance and wisdom accumulated over decades. He particularly enjoyed working with young people who were facing difficulties, who felt their lives were falling apart. He could look them in the eye and say, "I know how you feel. I've been there, and I'm here to tell you that there is hope on the other side." One Sunday morning, shortly before his 70th birthday, Thomas was invited again to share his testimony. It had been almost 20 years since he had last done so, and many in the congregation were now too young to remember the crisis that hit Timber Falls when Western Lumber closed. He climbed onto the pulpit, looked at the familiar and new faces before him, and smiled. "You know," he began, his voice still strong despite his age, "when I was younger I thought I knew what it meant to have faith. I thought it meant going to church, praying before meals, trying to be a good person. And those things are important, don't get me wrong. But that's not what faith really means." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "True faith is what remains when everything else is taken from you. It's the spark that keeps burning even in the deepest darkness. It's the quiet voice that says keep going when every part of you wants to give up." His eyes met Sarah in the congregation, still beautiful to him after all these years, still his rock, still his partner in everything. "Many years ago I lost my job. I almost lost my house. I almost lost my hope. But never, not for a moment, did I lose the things that truly mattered. And it took losing everything else for me to realize what those things were." He looked around the church, seeing Emma with her family, Josh next to his girlfriend, old and new friends, a community that had become his extended family. Life will test you. It will take things away from you. It will make you question everything you believe in. And in those moments, you will have to decide, will you cling to your faith or will you let it go? Her voice became softer, more intimate. "I chose to hold on. It wasn't easy. There were days when my faith was the size of a mustard seed, so small I could barely see it, but it was enough. And it grew, slowly, painfully, but it grew. And it carried me through the darkest days of my life to the other side, to the light." He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of gratitude in his chest. "So, if you take away just one thing from what I'm saying today, let it be this. No matter what you lose in life, no matter how dark things seem, don't lose your faith. Not necessarily in religion, although that can help, but faith in the fundamental goodness of life, faith that there is meaning in suffering, faith that better days will come. He smiled, and it was a smile full of genuine peace. Because they will come. I can guarantee you that. Better days will come, and when they do, you will look back and see that every step of the journey, even the most painful ones, brought you to where you needed to be. Jadil. When he stepped down from the pulpit this time, there wasn't just applause. There were people crying, people waving in recognition, people coming to embrace him and thank him for his words. And Thomas received each one of them with the same warmth, the same compassion that he had developed through his own trials. After the service, the Macready family gathered for Sunday lunch at their home, as they did almost every week. The table was filled not only with food, but with laughter, conversation, and the cheerful sounds of grandchildren running around the house. Sarah had cooked everyone's favorite roast, and the aroma filled the house with that feeling of home. Before they ate, as was tradition, Thomas asked for silence for prayer. "Dear God," he said, his voice breaking slightly with emotion, "how can we thank you enough for all the blessings you have given us, for this family, for this home, for this life we have built together from the ashes of our shattered plans." He looked around the table at each loved face. "Thank you for teaching us that losing everything can be the beginning of finding everything. Thank you for showing us that strength is not about never falling, but always getting back up. Thank you for proving repeatedly that you never abandon us, even when we cannot feel your presence." Sarah squeezed his hand, and he felt the familiar comfort of that touch. "Bless this food, this family, and all those who are still struggling, who are still in the dark valley, who cannot yet see the light. Give them strength to take another step, faith to believe in another day, hope to continue." "Amen. Amen," echoed the voices around the table. And as they ate and talked and laughed together, Thomas Macready looked around his table at his family and felt a gratitude so profound it almost hurt. He had lost so much all those years ago. His job, his financial security, his certainty about the future. But never, not for a moment, had he lost his faith. And that faith, nurtured through the most difficult years of his life, had become the foundation of all the good that followed. It had become the rock upon which he had built not just a new life, but a better, richer, more meaningful life than the one he had before. He was the lumberjack who lost everything except his faith. And in the end, he discovered that faith was the only thing he truly needed. Everything else stemmed from it: hope, love, purpose, peace. That night, after everyone had left and the house was quiet again, Thomas and Sarah sat together on the porch, as they did almost every night when the weather permitted. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "You know," Sarah said softly, resting her head on his shoulder, "sometimes I think about how different our lives could have been if you hadn't lost that job." Thomas considered this for a moment. "Different, certainly. Better? I'm not sure. You wouldn't have gone through all that pain. No, but I also wouldn't have learned what I've learned. I wouldn't have grown the way I've grown. I wouldn't have found my way back to faith." He kissed the top of her head. "I wouldn't have appreciated all of this the way I appreciate it now." They stood in silence for a while, simply watching the sunset, feeling the cool mountain breeze, listening to the sounds of the forest in the distance. "Do you have any regrets?" Sarah asked. Thomas thought carefully before answering. "I regret the times I let fear make me less than I should be. I regret the times I was too hard on myself, or when I let my frustration affect you. But the journey itself, the highs and lows, the losses and the victories, no. Because all of that brought me here, to this moment with you, with our family, with a life full of meaning and purpose." Sarah lifted her head and looked at him. "I love you, Thomas Macready. from day one until now, through everything. And I love you, Sarah Macready. You were my constant when everything else changed. My faith wavered, but you never did. We never, she corrected. It was always we. And there, sitting together as day gave way to night, the woodcutter who had lost everything but his faith felt a profound peace. His life had not been what he had planned. It had been harder, more challenging, filled with more pain than he had ever imagined he would have to endure. But it had also been richer, more meaningful, more full of love and purpose than his original plans could ever have been. He had discovered that sometimes God's greatest gift is not giving us what we ask for, but guiding us through the dark valley to a place we didn't even know we were looking for. A place of true faith, tested and proven. A place of strong family, united by shared adversity. A place of purpose, found not in easy success, but in struggle and growth. A place of peace, achieved not in the absence of problems, but in the presence of unwavering faith. Thomas Macready had lost a great deal, but in the process of losing, he had found everything that truly mattered. And as the stars began to appear in the darkened sky above the Rocky Mountains, he whispered one last prayer of gratitude, not for having been spared the hardships, but for having been carried through them, emerging on the other side stronger, wiser, and more complete than he had ever been before. This was his story, a story of loss and redemption, of despair and hope, of falling and rising again. But above all, it was a story of faith. Faith that remained when everything else was taken away. Faith that carried him through the darkest night to dawn. Faith that in the end proved to be the only thing he truly needed. And this faith, passed on now to his children and grandchildren, would continue. A legacy more valuable than any material fortune. A light that would continue to shine through the generations, reminding all who came after him that no matter what life takes from you, no matter how dark the days become, faith can carry you through any storm to a safe harbor on the other side.